Before there was water, there was only waiting. In the time before time had learned to move, the world existed not as a place but as a feeling, a vast, formless exhale that hung between the nothing and the something, neither dark nor light, neither silent nor loud, but something older than all of those things, something that had no name because there was no one yet to give names to anything. This was chaos. Not chaos in the way that word would later be used by men who had never truly seen it. Not disorder, not confusion, not the frenzy of a storm, but a deep, primordial openness, a readiness, the universe holding its breath before it remembered how to breathe. From that openness, slowly, the way a dream takes shape in the moments just before waking, things began to gather themselves. Gaia came first, the earth, pulling herself together from nothing into something immense and patient and solid, her body stretching out in all directions until she was the ground beneath everything else. Tartarus came, sinking below her like a root that has no end, descending into a darkness so profound that even darkness could not find itself there. And Eros came, not love as men would one day understand it, but something more fundamental, the force that draws one thing toward another, the invisible thread that would pull all of creation into being. In those first long ages, the world was quieter than any silence you have ever heard. Gaia breathed in long geological sighs. Rivers did not yet know where they were going. The sky was not yet a sky, but only a great height, an absence of ground. And the waters were already there, already ancient, already dreaming in the low places of the earth, already knowing something that the rest of the world would take a very long time to learn. Then came the Titans. They rose the way mountains rise, slowly, inevitably, without asking permission. They were enormous in every sense of the word, not merely in their bodies, which were vast enough that a single one of them walking across the young earth left impressions in the ground that became valleys, but enormous in their presence, in the weight they carried simply by existing. Oceanus, who was himself a great river, wrapped himself around the entire world and never stopped moving. Hyperion gathered light and carried it in his chest. Mnemosyne held in her quiet mind every moment that had ever passed and every moment that had not yet arrived. They were not gods in the way that gods would later be understood. They were something older, something that had not yet decided what it was. Among them was Kronos. He was the youngest of his brothers and sisters, and perhaps because of this he had always felt the particular hunger of someone who arrived too late to a table that was already full. He was sharp where the others were broad, calculating where the others were elemental, and where his siblings seemed content simply to be, to exist in their enormous, purposeful way and ask nothing further of the world. Kronos wanted. He wanted in the way that a deep cold wants to spread, in the way that shadow wants to fill every space that light has not yet reached. When his father Uranos, the sky, grew fearful of his children and pushed them back into Gaia's body to keep them contained, it was Kronos who listened to his mother's grief. It was Kronos who took the blade. What happened between Kronos and Uranos is a story that the earth still carries in its oldest stones, in the layers of rock that remember every age. The sky was wounded. Uranos withdrew from Gaia forever, pulling himself up and away and staying there, distant and cold and full of stars, And from where his blood fell into the sea, things were born. Beautiful, terrible things. Foam and fury, and the first of the furies. But that is another current in another river. And we are following only one river tonight. And it flows toward the sea. Kronos ruled then. He took his sister Rhea as his consort, and they reigned together over the world in an age that later generations would look back on as golden. Though it was golden only in the way that something can seem golden from a very great distance, when you cannot see its edges or its shadows. The Titans multiplied. The world continued to form itself. Land separating from sea, mountains finding their height, rivers learning the patience of their long journeys to the ocean. And Kronos sat at the center of it all, vast and cold and powerful and afraid, because there was a prophecy. It had come from Gaia and Ouranos both, a warning wrapped in the certainty of something already written, that Kronos would be overthrown by his own child, just as he had overthrown his own father. The words of it are old, and they do not change no matter how many times they are told. And Kronos heard them the way a stone hears water, felt them wearing at him even when he tried not to listen. He heard them in the wind. He heard them in the space between his own heartbeats. He heard them in the eyes of his wife whenever she looked at him with that careful, measuring gaze that wives give to men who are afraid of their own fate. And so he decided, in the way that frightened things decide, not with wisdom, but with force, that the prophecy would not come true, that the future could be swallowed before it arrived. Rhea bore their first child in the soft dark of an early world, and before the infant had drawn more than a few breaths of the cool ancient air, Kronos took the child and swallowed it whole. Not in anger, that is the detail that is most difficult to hold, not in rage or in madness, but with a kind of grim deliberateness, a cold practicality, as if this were simply a problem being solved. The child was Hestia, goddess of the hearth, and she disappeared into the dark interior of her father as if she had never existed at all. Time passed. Time in that age passed differently than it does now, in great slow surges, like tides moved by a moon much closer to the earth than it has since retreated. Rhea bore another child, Demeter, goddess of the grain, goddess of the growing things. She too was taken before her first cry had finished echoing off the rocks. Then Hera, then Hades. Each time, Rhea held what she had made and felt it taken from her, and each time the grief settled deeper into her like water finding its lowest level, and the stone of her endurance grew harder and colder and more resolute. And then came the night when she carried yet another child, and she lay in the dark knowing that in the morning the same thing would happen again. And she lay there with her hand pressed against the warmth of her own body, and something in her, some ancient geological patience, finally, quietly, made up its mind. She would not let this one go. She lay in the dark with her hand still pressed to the warmth of her own body, and her mind moved slowly and carefully through what she was going to do. Rhea had the patience of stone, which is to say she had the kind of patience that does not feel like patience at all, but like something deeper and more permanent. The patience of a thing that has been waiting long enough that it no longer experiences waiting as waiting, but simply as existing. She had given 4 children to the dark interior of her husband. She had felt each loss settle into her like a stone dropped into still water, sinking without a sound to the very bottom. And now she lay in the cool of the early world, listening to the breathing of the earth around her, and she thought about what it means to save something. She would go to Crete. The idea came to her not like a sudden brightness, but like the slow return of warmth after a long winter, gradually, inevitably, as if it had always been there, only waiting for her to be still enough to feel it. There was a cave on that island, deep in the belly of Mount Ida, a place where the earth folded in upon itself and made a darkness so complete and so hushed that even the gods could lose themselves in it. She would go there to give birth. She would wrap a stone in cloth and give it to Kronos in place of the child. And Kronos, in his cold certainty that the future was his to control, would swallow the stone and never know the difference. It is a strange thing that even the most powerful being in the world can be deceived by love. Not by cleverness alone, not by strategy alone, but by the particular clarity of mind that comes to someone who has decided completely and without reservation that something must be protected. The child was born in the cave on Ida in the deep of the night. Rhea held him for a long moment in the dark, feeling the particular weight of a new life, the warmth of it, the absolute vulnerability of it, and then she gave him to the nymphs of the mountain who had agreed to care for him in secret. The Koyurites, young men of the island, stood guard outside the cave, and whenever the infant cried, they clashed their weapons together so that the sound of his crying was swallowed by the noise of bronze on bronze and rose toward the sky as something unrecognizable, something that could not be traced back to any small and vulnerable source. Then Rhea returned to Kronos with the stone. He took it without looking closely. That is the thing about certainty. It makes you careless. Kronos was so sure that he had already solved the problem of his fate that he did not examine what he was given. He swallowed the stone as he had swallowed the others and went back to his cold and watchful reign. And the child who would one day become Zeus grew in secret on the island of Crete, fed on honey and the milk of the divine goat Amalthea, raised by the mountain and the wind and the careful attention of those who knew what he was. And in the dark interior of Kronos, the others waited. It is here that we must slow down and stay a while, because this is where our story truly begins. In that impossible and lightless place inside a Titan's body where four gods existed without growing, without changing, without experiencing anything that could be called a life. What was it like that waiting? The old stories do not linger here. They move past it quickly the way stories tend to move past the parts that have no action, no visible drama. But if you let your mind go slow and quiet and follow the thread of it down into the dark, there is something there worth feeling. Imagine a stillness so complete that stillness itself loses its meaning. Not sleep. Sleep has a rhythm to it, a tide of depth and surface, a current of dreaming that moves through the body like water through stone. This was not sleep. It was something older than sleep, something that predated the division of experience into waking and not waking. It was pure existence stripped of everything except the bare fact of being. No hunger, because hunger requires a body that is living in time. No cold, no warmth, no sound, no light. Only the deep, formless awareness that one was. This is where Poseidon existed for an age. He was not suffering. That is important to understand. And it is perhaps the most difficult thing to hold in the mind. because we are creatures of time and sensation, and the idea of existing without either feels to us like deprivation. But Poseidon was a god, and what a god is, at its most fundamental, is a force. And a force does not need time to remain itself. Water does not need to be moving to be water. The ocean, even still, even under ice, even in the absolute dark of the deepest trench where no light has ever reached, is still entirely and completely the ocean. And somewhere in that lightless interior, the god who would one day rule all the waters of the world existed in a state of perfect, indifferentiated potential. The way a wave exists in the open sea before it has found its shore, before it has learned what shape it is going to take when it finally arrives. Around him, in that same dark, his sisters were present. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, each in their own stillness, each carrying within themselves the seed of what they would one day become. There was no conversation. There was no awareness of one another in any way that would have been recognizable to a thinking mind. But there was something, some faint harmonic between them. The way instruments left in the same room will slowly, over time, come to share their vibration. The way the strings of a harp will answer the note of a lyre played nearby even when no hand has touched them. They were together in the dark in the way that seeds are together in the ground before spring, each entirely enclosed in its own silence, and yet all of them part of the same patient waiting. Then Hades was swallowed, and the waiting grew by one more presence, and the dark deepened by one more shade. On the surface of the world, time was moving in its long geological way. Continents pressed against each other and found their shapes. Rivers carved their channels slowly through rock that had no choice but to yield. The sea that Poseidon had not yet claimed, that did not yet know it had a master waiting for it in the dark, moved in its tides, pulled by forces it could not name, already ancient, already containing within its depths creatures of such extraordinary strangeness that even the gods would one day be astonished by them. The sea was doing what it has always done, what it will always do, which is simply to be itself completely and without apology, the most patient and the most powerful presence on the surface of the earth. And in the cave on Crete, Zeus was growing. The years passed the way years pass in an age before anyone is counting them, not in a line but in a spiral, each season returning to something like itself but not exactly itself, the world slowly changing in ways so gradual that only the mountains noticed, and the mountains said nothing. Zeus learned to walk on the rocky slopes of Ida. He learned the taste of honey and the sound of wind through the mouth of the cave. He learned the weight of his own body and the strength that was building in it, quiet and enormous, like a storm gathering itself over a warm sea before it has decided which way to move. The nymphs who cared for him were gentle, and the goat Amalthea gave her milk without complaint, and the island held him in its ancient way, teaching him the particular wisdom of things that grow close to the earth. Kronos sat on his cold throne and watched the horizon and felt the prophecy in his bones like an ache he could not locate, a tremor in the deepest foundation of his certainty. He watched his Titan siblings moving through the world in their enormous, elemental ways, and he felt the weight of what he had swallowed, and he told himself, in the way that frightened things tell themselves things, that what he had done was enough, that the future was contained, that the stone he did not know he had swallowed sat in the dark beside 4 divine presences, and that all of them together were held, We're sealed. We're harmless. He was wrong, of course. He had always been wrong. The prophecy did not care about his certainty. The future does not negotiate with the present about when it will arrive. On Crete, in the long cool evenings when the light came sideways across the island and the sea below glittered with a gold that seemed almost too beautiful to be accidental, Zeus sat at the mouth of the cave and looked out at the water and felt in himself something that was not yet fully formed, a sense of what he was and what he was going to do, the way a river feels the pull of the sea long before it has found it. He was almost ready. The world was almost ready. The long sleep of his brothers and sisters in the dark was almost at its end. And in the deep interior of Kronos, where the god of the sea waited in his perfect and dimensionless stillness, something that was not quite a feeling but was the ancestor of feeling began, very slowly, like the first warmth of a sun that has not yet risen, to stir. That faint stirring in the deep dark, that first tremor of something that was not quite waking and not quite dreaming, moved through Poseidon like a tide beginning to turn, slow, inevitable, answering a call that had not yet been spoken aloud. On the surface of the world, Zeus had made his decision. He had sat long enough at the mouth of the cave on Ida, long enough watching the sea catch the light and release it, long enough feeling the enormous quiet patience of what he carried inside him building and building until the weight of it was no longer something he could hold still. He was ready, not in the way that young things are often ready, impulsively, carelessly, with more confidence than understanding, but in the deeper way, the way a storm is ready when every condition has been met, when the sea is warm enough and the air is cold enough and the pressure has been building for long enough that what comes next is not a choice but a consequence. He went to his father's court not with weapons drawn, but with something more unsettling to a tyrant than any weapon, with certainty, and with a draft that Gaia herself had helped him prepare, a mixture drawn from the deep knowledge of the earth, something that would undo the iron grip of a Titan's stomach and return what had been taken. Kronos drank it without knowing what it was. That is the version the old stories agree on, though they differ in their details. As old stories always do, each teller adding the particular emphasis of their own understanding. What matters is not the precise mechanism, but the consequence, which arrived the way consequences always arrive suddenly, after a very long wait. The stone came first. It rose from within Kronos and emerged into the light of the world with a heaviness that was not merely physical. A heaviness compounded of all the years it had spent pretending to be something it was not. And it struck the earth at a place that would one day be called Delphi, and the earth received it and held it. And for a very long time afterward that stone would be considered the most sacred object in the world, the navel of everything. The place where the center of the world had been marked by the great deception that changed the course of all things. Then the gods came. Hestia first, as she had been taken first, and her emergence was quiet in the way that she herself was always quiet, a warmth spreading through the air around the place where she appeared, the particular comfort of a fire that has been carefully tended. Then Demeter, and with her a smell of turned earth and green things, the deep fertility of a world that had been waiting for her to remember it. Then Hera, already carrying herself with the particular gravity of someone who has spent an eternity in the dark deciding exactly who she is going to be when the light returns. Then Hades, His emergence was slower than the others, deeper somehow, as if part of him had grown accustomed to the dark and was not entirely certain it wanted to leave it. He stood in the new light of the world and looked at it with eyes that had never seen light before, and would ever after carry in them a preference for shadow, a nostalgia for the profound quiet of the place they had come from. He was already himself completely, already the god he would always be, and he looked at the world with a stillness that was not sadness, but was adjacent to it, the way deep water is adjacent to the surface without ever quite becoming it. And then Poseidon. What happened when Poseidon came into the world is not something that the old stories linger on, and this is perhaps because it happened too quickly for language to follow. Or perhaps because the people who first told these stories sensed something in it that was too large for ordinary words, something that needed to be approached slowly and with patience, the way you approach the sea itself, not all at once, but gradually, letting the cold of it reach you in stages, letting your body adjust to the immensity of what it is encountering. He had been in the dark for longer than mountains take to form. He had existed in a stillness so complete that stillness had become his nature, had soaked into the deepest part of what he was. And then all at once, not gradually, not gently, but all at once, the world arrived. Light came first, and it was not merely brightness but information, an overwhelming flood of it, every surface and distance and texture of the world presenting itself simultaneously to senses that had never been used before. Then sound, the wind, the sea below somewhere, the breathing of his siblings nearby, the vast low sound of the earth itself going about its ancient business, and then temperature, and then the smell of the air, which was salt and stone and something green and something older than other of those things, and then the weight of his own body, which was the strangest thing of all, the discovery that he had edges, that he ended somewhere, that he was not infinite but particular, not everything but specifically and completely himself. He stood in the light of a very old world and felt it all pouring into him and did not move for a long moment. Around him, his siblings were finding their feet, were looking at each other and at the sky and at the earth with the dazed wonder of people waking from a sleep they had not chosen. And Kronos was already diminished, already something less than what he had been. The certainty draining out of him the way water drains from a cracked vessel, slowly and completely and without any possibility of being recovered. But Poseidon was barely aware of any of that yet. He was aware of the sea. He could hear it below somewhere, not far, its voice carrying up through the rock with the ease of something that has been speaking forever and has never once considered that it might not be heard. It was a sound he had never heard before and yet recognized completely, the way you sometimes recognize in waking life a landscape you have only ever seen in dreams, with a certainty that is deeper than memory and cannot be fully explained. The sea was calling, and some part of him that had no name yet answered, and the answer was not a thought or a feeling, but something more fundamental than either of those things. Something in the architecture of what he was, some resonance between his nature and the nature of the water that would one day be his. But the world was not yet divided. The sea had no lord yet. First, there was a war to endure. The Titans did not yield their dominion quietly. Of course they did not. They were ancient and enormous and had been the rulers of the world for longer than anyone had been counting. And the children of Kronos, newly emerged from the dark, still finding the edges of their own strength, still learning what they were capable of, must have seemed to the older powers like something that could be contained, could be pushed back, could be returned to silence if the force applied was great enough. The Titans gathered themselves the way weather gathers, slowly and then all at once. And the war that followed, the Titanomachy, as it would later be named, in that human habit of giving names to things as a way of making them manageable, lasted for 10 years, which in the age of gods means something different than it means to us. 10 years being not a counted span but a duration of grinding, geological endurance. It was not a war of swift movements and sudden victories. That is the most important thing to understand about it, and the thing most easily forgotten. It was a war of enormous, slow forces pressing against each other across vast distances, the kind of conflict that reshapes the world simply by occurring. The way two tectonic plates pressing against each other do not announce their intentions but simply push and push and push until the land has no choice but to change. Mountains were used as weapons and were broken into using. The sea was thrown against coastlines that no longer exist. The sky groaned under the weight of what was passing through it. The earth cracked along lines that became valleys, and the valleys filled with water, and the water became rivers that are still running today, still carrying in their currents some faint echo of the force that created them. Poseidon fought in the way that water fights, which is to say with a persistence that does not tire and a force that increases rather than diminishes the more it is contained. He was still learning the full extent of what he could do, still discovering in the heat of each confrontation new depths to his own power, the way a river discovers its own strength only by meeting the stone that tries to stop it. He moved through the battle with a focus that was almost serene, his enormous presence pressing against the lines of Titan resistance with the unhurried certainty of a tide coming in. And then the Cyclops were freed. They had been imprisoned by Oranos long ago. These three enormous beings, Brontes the Thunderer, Starapus the Lightning Maker, Argus the Bright One, held in the deep dark of Tartarus for the same fearful reason that Kronos had swallowed his children, because power that is frightened of what it cannot control tends always toward the same solution, which is containment, which is silence, which is the dark. Zeus released them and they came up from the depths with the particular energy of things that had been waiting a very long time to make something, their hands full of the gifts they had been preparing in the long centuries of their imprisonment. For Zeus, the thunderbolt; for Hades, the helmet of darkness; for Poseidon, the trident. He felt it before he fully saw it, the weight of it arriving in his hands with a rightness so complete it was like remembering rather than receiving. 3 tines of a metal that had no name, forged in the deepest part of the earth where heat and pressure and time conspired to make things that cannot be made any other way. And it hummed in his grip with a frequency that matched something in his chest, something in the deepest register of what he was. He held it and felt the earth below his feet answer, felt the faintest tremor run through the rock in every direction from the point where he was standing, as if the world had recognized what was now touching it and was responding the only way he knew how. He struck the ground once, lightly, almost experimentally, the way a musician will sometimes pluck a single string simply to hear the note it carries. The earth shook for 7 miles in every direction. He stood very still for a moment after that, feeling the reverberations moving outward through the stone beneath him like ripples moving outward across the surface of still water. And something settled in him that had been unsettled since the moment he emerged from the dark. Some last question about what he was and what he was for, finding its answer in the shudder of the world beneath his feet. The sea below was churning in response, throwing itself against the rocks with a new urgency, and the sound of it rose toward him like a greeting, like a recognition, like something that had been waiting for exactly this moment to say what it had always meant to say. The war was not over. There were long years still ahead of it, long years of that grinding geological endurance, of force pressed against force across the shaking body of the world. But something had shifted. The balance had tilted in the way that balances tilt when a new and decisive weight has been added to one side, slowly at first and then with gathering speed. And the titans who had seemed so immovable began to feel for the first time the particular cold uncertainty of those who have been certain for too long. Poseidon moved through the remaining years of the war with his trident in his hand and the sea at his back, and the two of them together, the god and the water, made something that the titans had not encountered before in all their ancient reign. They made the future. The last of the titans fell the way the last light falls at the end of a very long day. Not suddenly, not with any single decisive moment, but gradually, the resistance draining out of them like color draining from the sky, until what remained was simply the quiet of a world that had finished one long chapter and had not yet begun the next. The war was over. What followed was a stillness so profound that the earth itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to find out what kind of world it was going to be now that the old order had ended and the new one had not yet fully declared its shape. The titans who had not been imprisoned were withdrawn, diminished, retreating to the margins of the world where they would remain. Not gone, never entirely gone, but quieted, like embers that have lost the will to become flame again. Atlas, who had led the Titan armies, was given his particular punishment. The sky placed on his shoulders like a weight that matched the weight of his ambition, and he stood at the western edge of the world and held it up and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. And Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades stood together in the new silence of a world they had won and looked at each other across all the things that had passed between them, all the years of the dark and all the years of the war, and understood without speaking that what came next had to be decided carefully. The world needed to be divided. There was a rightness to this that all three of them felt, though perhaps for different reasons. A world with one ruler is a world with one kind of attention, one kind of will pressing down upon everything, and they had all seen where that led. They had spent their earliest existence inside the consequences of it, sealed in the dark by a father who believed that control and containment were the same thing as safety. Three rulers meant three attentions, three wills, three ways of understanding what the world was and what it needed. It meant argument, certainly, and rivalry, and the particular friction of powerful things existing in proximity to each other. But it also meant that no single fear could swallow everything whole. They decided it by lot. This too had a rightness to it, not the rightness of logic, but the deeper rightness of surrender, of acknowledging that some things are larger than the preferences of even the most powerful beings, that fate has its own understanding of who belongs where. They drew lots and the world sorted itself accordingly, and what the lots decided has never, in all the long ages since, been undone. Zeus received the sky. Hades received the deep dark of the underworld, that vast and lightless country beneath the roots of everything. And he went down into it with the same stillness he had carried since emerging from within Kronos, as if the underground were not a consolation but a recognition, as if some part of him had known all along that this was where he was going. Mount Olympus and the broad earth itself were held in common between all three, neutral ground, the shared surface of the world where all things met and all things were possible. And Poseidon received the sea. He stood at the edge of it for a long moment before he descended. The sea in that age was different from what it would later become, not in its nature, which has never changed, but in its relationship to the world around it. It had no master. It had been doing what it does since before there were gods to observe it, following the ancient instructions of gravity and wind and the pull of the moon, filling every low place with its patient immensity, carving coastlines according to its own unhurried preferences, sustaining within its depths a world of such complexity and strangeness that even now, even after all the ages of gods and heroes and mortals, the deepest parts of it remain largely unknown. It was not waiting for Poseidon. The sea does not wait for anything. But when he came to its edge and looked out across its surface, gray-green and shifting in the early light, stretching in every direction to the curved horizon, something passed between them that was not quite recognition and not quite greeting, but was something of both, the way two forces that have always been meant for each other acknowledge each other when they finally meet. He walked into it. The cold came first, climbing his legs with the particular intimacy of water, finding every surface, pressing everywhere at once with an evenness that nothing else in the world achieves. Then the sound changed, the air sounds dropping away and the deeper sounds of the water rising to take their place, the low, complex murmur of it, all its movements speaking at once in a language that required no translation. Then the light changed, the flat brightness of the surface giving way to something green and diffuse and endlessly more interesting. Light that had been divided and scattered and redirected by the water until it became a completely different kind of light, a gentle, shifting illumination that fell on everything equally and made everything seem both more real and more dreamlike at the same time. He went deeper. The pressure increased gradually, a soft and total embrace, the water growing darker in slow stages, green becoming a blue so deep it was almost black, and still he descended, feeling the sea accepting him in the way that a place accepts the person who belongs to it, without ceremony, without question, simply opening around him and then closing again above him and making him part of itself. Fish moved around him in their ancient, unconcerned way, creatures of a world that had been complex and complete long before any god had thought to claim it. Strange lights bloomed in the dark below. Bioluminescent things, cold fire things, creatures so perfectly adapted to the pressure and the darkness that they had become something entirely other than what swam in the shallows above. And at the bottom of the deepest trench in the deepest part of the sea, Poseidon found what was waiting for him. His palace. It had not been built by any hand. It had not been constructed in any way that could be called construction. It had simply grown over the long ages before he arrived, the way coral grows, slowly, without plan, in response to the particular conditions of the place where it forms, each piece adding itself to the whole according to rules so deep they cannot be called rules at all, but only nature, only the inevitable expression of what a thing is. It rose from the ocean floor in towers of coral and deep-sea stone, vast and pale in the lightless water, its architecture following no human principle but its own, its spires reaching upward into the dark the way all things reach toward light even when light cannot reach them. He moved through it slowly, learning its rooms the way you learn a dream, not by studying it but by letting it unfold around you, trusting that the next passage will lead somewhere that makes sense, that the space as a whole has an internal logic that will reveal itself in time. The floors were smooth stone worn smooth by centuries of current. The walls were encrusted with the slow accumulation of the sea's own making, barnacle and anemone and the patient architecture of things that have nothing to do but grow. Great columns of basalt rose to ceilings so high they were lost in the dark above. And through gaps in those ceilings the deep currents moved like slow breath, carrying with them the cold and the particular mineral smell of very deep water, a smell that has no analog in the world above and cannot be described to anyone who has not been far enough down to encounter it. There were gardens in the spaces between the palace's towers, where the ocean floor flattened and the sediment lay undisturbed by current. Forests of black coral grew in shapes of extraordinary complexity, their branches dividing and dividing again according to a mathematics of perfect patience, each division smaller than the last until the tips of the branches were too fine to see individually, the whole structure becoming at its edges a kind of dark mist, a transition between solid and liquid that had no clear boundary. Among these coral forests moved creatures that had never been seen from the surface, translucent things, slow things, things whose bodies were more light than matter, drifting through the dark gardens with the unhurried purposefulness of beings that have never learned fear because nothing in their world has ever threatened them. Poseidon moved through the gardens and felt something he had not expected to feel, something that took him a long time to name because he had so little experience with feelings as yet, having spent his existence either in the lightless stillness inside his father or in the grinding noise and force of a decade of war. What he felt, moving through the black coral gardens in the profound quiet of the deep ocean, was peace. Not the peace of absence, not the non-feeling of the dark inside Kronos, but the peace of presence, the peace of being exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are supposed to do, which in this case was simply existing in a place that matched you completely, a place whose nature and your nature were the same nature expressed in two different forms. The sea was not his because he had won it. The sea was his because he was, in some fundamental sense, made of the same thing the sea was made of, the same restlessness, the same depth, the same capacity for both extraordinary stillness and extraordinary force, the same ancient patience that can wait 1,000 years and then move a mountain. He settled into it gradually, over what would have been a very long time by any mortal reckoning. He explored the full extent of his domain, which was vast beyond any easy imagining. The sea in all its breadth and depth, all its trenches and ridges and plains of soft sediment, all its currents moving in their great slow circles like the breathing of something too large to see whole. He came to know the character of each part of it, the particular temper of each sea, the way the northern waters moved differently from the southern ones, colder and more deliberate, and the way the deep currents flowed according to laws of temperature and salt that were older than any law the gods had made. He came to know the creatures. This took the longest, because the sea contains more kinds of life than any other place in the world. And each kind had its own nature and its own claim on the water. And Poseidon felt toward all of them something that was not quite tenderness. Tenderness was not quite the right shape for what he felt, but was a kind of profound respect, the respect of one deep thing for other deep things. The acknowledgement that they had been here before him and would likely be here after him, and that their presence in his kingdom was not a coincidence or a decoration, but the very substance of what the kingdom was. The whales moved through his domain like slow clouds, their songs filling the middle depths with a music so low and so complex that it took years to hear the whole of any single phrase. The great fish schooled in the shallower waters above the continental shelves, their bodies catching what light descended from the surface and throwing it back in brief cold flashes. The creatures of the deep trench, the ones that lived at pressures that would have flattened anything born of the surface world, went about their ancient business in the dark with the serene indifference of things that have solved every problem their existence presents and have nothing further to worry about. And in the palace of deep-sea stone and black coral, in the vast quiet of the deepest water, Poseidon sat on a throne that had been waiting for him since before he was born, and he felt the weight of the sea above him and around him and below him, and he felt the tremor of the earth through the ocean floor, and he felt the distant pull of the moon moving the tides at the surface far above. And all of it was his, all of it was him, all of it was the same thing wearing different forms. He was home. For the first time in his existence, which had been long and dark and full of endurance, he was simply, completely, and without reservation home. But the sea, vast as it was only part of what he was. There were things on the surface of the world that were also calling to him, the earth itself, trembling under his trident's potential, the broad plains and the rocky shores and the rivers running to find him, and above all the sky with its weather and its storms, which would one day learn to answer to his mood as readily as the water did. The palace in the deep was his foundation, his stillness, the place he returned to when the world above became too much or not enough. For now, though, he was still. The sea moved around him in its eternal way, and the creatures of the deep drifted through the coral gardens, and the currents carried their cold cargo of salt and pressure through the dark halls of the palace. And Poseidon breathed the deep water in and out and felt, for the first time, the extraordinary luxury of simply being what he was, in the place that was made for him. With all the long, restless ages of waiting finally behind him. The palace settled around him like a second skin, and Poseidon rested in it for a long while, feeling the deep currents move through its halls like slow breath. But stillness, for him, was never permanent. He was not made for sitting. He was made for movement, for the restless exploration of depth and distance, for the particular pleasure of a force that has not yet found all the edges of itself. And so, gradually, the way a tide turns without announcing its intention, he began to move outward from the palace, upward through the dark water, toward the surface of things. He rose slowly through the layers of the sea. The black of the deepest water gave way to a dark blue. The dark blue softened into something lighter, then lighter still. The pressure eased around him in careful degrees, and then, After a long ascent through water that grew warmer and greener with every passing fathom, he broke the surface. The air hit him differently than it had on the day he first emerged from within Kronos. That day had been overwhelming, too much sensation arriving all at once. This time he was ready for it. He felt the wind move across his face and noted the salt in it. He heard the waves around him, each one a slightly different voice. The whole surface of the sea speaking in a language made entirely of repetition and variation. He looked up at the sky, which was vast and pale and very far away, and he felt the distance between himself and Zeus in a way that was not unfriendly but was simply real. They were brothers who ruled different countries. The sky was not his, but everything below it, everywhere the water touched, was. He began to learn the surface world the same way he had learned the deep, slowly, without hurry, moving from place to place with the patient curiosity of someone who has all the time there is. He found the coastlines first. He learned the way the sea met the land, which was never simple, never just an edge. In some places the land came down to the water gradually, in long shallow beaches where the waves spread themselves thin before retreating, each one leaving a dark line in the sand to mark how far it had come. In other places the land arrived at the sea as cliff, sheer and absolute, and the waves struck it with a force that it had been building across open water for 1,000 miles, the collision sending white water high into the air and a low boom through the rock that could be felt rather than heard, a vibration in the chest, a reminder of how much patience and how much violence could exist in the same body. Poseidon loved the cliffs best. He returned to them often. Then he found the shallows above the continental shelves, where the water was warm and clear and full of light. He moved through coral reefs that were cities in themselves, more complex and more densely inhabited than any city the surface world would later build. Every surface was claimed by something. Every gap between the coral branches sheltered something small and watchful. The water tasted different here, warmer and more alive, full of the chemical conversation of 10,000 creatures going about their 10,000 forms of business. He moved through it quietly, watching, learning the texture of this part of his kingdom that was as different from the black coral gardens of the deep as morning is from midnight. He found the rivers where they met the sea. These interested him greatly. A river is a kind of sea in miniature, a body of moving water with its own character and its own destination. And where a river meets the sea, something interesting happens. The two waters resist each other for a while before they merge, the fresh pushing against the salt pushing back, the boundary between them visible as a change in color, a line drawn across the water in two different shades of blue. Poseidon stood in these meeting places and felt both waters against his skin and thought about boundaries, about the places where one thing ends and another begins, about how those places are always the most interesting places in any landscape. Then he turned his attention to the earth beneath his feet. The trident had been in his hand since the Cyclops gave it to him. He had used it in the war, had felt the earth answer when he struck it, but in the chaos and noise of battle he had not been able to give his full attention to what was happening when the 3 times touched the ground. Now, in the quiet of the post-war world, he could be more deliberate. He chose a place on the shore where the rock was old and dense, a gray-black stone that had been here since before the Titans, since before anything with a name had walked across it. He raised the trident and brought it down. The sound it made was not loud. That surprised him. He had expected something dramatic. A crack, a roar, something commensurate with what he felt moving through his arm when the tines connected. But the sound was almost gentle, a low, dense thud that seemed to go downward rather than outward. And then, half a breath later, the earth moved. Not violently, not catastrophically. It moved the way very deep things move, with a slowness that communicated just how much mass was involved, just how much energy was required to shift even a little of it. The rock beneath his feet groaned in a register so low it was felt more than heard. The sea behind him responded immediately, pulling back from the shore and then returning with more force, as if the ocean and the earth were in conversation and the earth had just said something that required a response. He struck again, this time harder. The ground cracked in a line running away from him across the rock, a clean fracture that went deeper than it looked, and from that crack came the smell of the interior of the earth, hot and mineral and ancient, a smell that had never been open to the air before, the smell of stone that has been sealed in darkness since the world was young. Steam followed the smell, thin and pale, dissipating quickly in the coastal wind. He understood then what the trident was. Not just a weapon, not just a symbol of authority. It was a key to the hidden architecture of the world, to the network of faults and fissures and underground rivers that ran beneath the surface of everything. With it he could speak to the earth in the earth's own language, which was the language of pressure and release, of force held in tension for a very long time and then, at precisely the right moment, allowed to move. He spent a long time learning this language. He walked through the young world with his trident in his hand and felt the earth beneath him the way a musician feels the instrument beneath their fingers, not as a separate thing but as an extension of himself, a medium through which what was inside him could be expressed. He learned the fault lines, those deep cracks in the foundation of the world where two vast plates of stone pressed against each other in a slow and endless negotiation. He learned the underground rivers, the ones that moved through the dark interior of the earth without ever seeing the sky, finding their way through limestone and granite by the patient logic of water, which is always, eventually, to find the lowest point. He learned to feel storms before they arrived. The pressure in the air changed in a particular way before a storm, and the sea responded to that change before the sky made it visible, the waves growing longer and more deliberate, the surface taking on a certain quality of anticipation. He learned to read this, to know from the way the water moved what the weather was preparing to do, and in time he learned not just to read the weather but to influence it, to drive his chariot across the surface of the sea and feel the wind respond to his mood, the sky darkening or clearing in rough correspondence with whatever was moving through him. Then he created the horse. The old stories tell this differently depending on who is telling them. Some say he created the horse in a contest with Athena, striking the earth to produce his gift in competition with her olive tree. Some say he created it simply because the idea came to him one day while standing on a shore watching the waves come in. Both versions may be true. The gods are not bound by the rule that says a thing can only have one origin. What is certain is this. He stood on a rocky shore and watched the large wave build itself in the deep water offshore. He watched it organize itself, gather its energy upward from the depths, and begin its long journey toward the land. As it moved, it changed shape, the back of it rising as the front slowed in the shallowing water, the whole thing rearing up in that final moment before it broke, white foam flying from its crest like the mane of something alive. He raised his trident and struck the wet sand at the water's edge. What rose from the foam was not immediately recognizable. For a moment it was only spray in motion, white water thrown upward in a column that seemed too organized to be accidental, too purposeful to be just the consequence of a wave meeting a rock. Then the form in the spray began to resolve itself. 4 legs, impossibly long and already moving. A neck that arched back against itself in the particular way that would forever after be the most beautiful line in the world. A chest broad enough to contain a bellows that could pump air to carry a creature across the length of a continent without stopping. The horse shook the water from itself and stood on the wet sand and looked at Poseidon with dark eyes that contained something unexpected. Not the blankness of an animal, not the unconcerned attention of a fish or a bird, something more complex. A kind of awareness that was almost recognition, as if the horse knew what it was and where it had come from, and felt about both of those things something that could not be called a feeling, but was the ancestor of one. Poseidon stood very still and looked back. The horse was beautiful in a way that was almost painful to look at directly, the way very perfect things are sometimes painful, because they make the rest of the world seem briefly insufficient by comparison. It was white, the particular white of sea foam, which is not a simple white but contains within it all the colors of the water and the sky, all the blues and grays and greens that foam picks up and holds briefly before dissolving back into the sea. It stood on the wet sand and the waves came in around its legs and it did not move away from them. It had been born of the sea and the sea was not something it needed to fear. Poseidon reached out and placed one hand on the horse's neck. The animal's skin was warm despite the cold water it had come from. He felt the muscles beneath, enormous and patient, the deep power of a body built for sustained movement over long distances, a body that was essentially a very elegant machine for converting the energy of the earth into forward motion. He felt a pulse in the neck, strong and unhurried, and it seemed to match the rhythm of the waves coming in around their feet. And that seemed right, seemed like the correct way for a thing born of the sea to be. He stood there for a long time with his hand on the horse's neck, the waves moving around them both, the sound of the sea filling the space between every thought. The world above the water was wide and full of things he had not yet encountered, full of gods and mortals and stories that had not yet begun. The world below the water was deep and complex and entirely his, its rhythms already as familiar to him as his own breathing. And here on the shore between them, where the sea and the land negotiated their endless boundary, he had made something new, something that belonged to both worlds, as he did, something that carried in its bones the memory of the wave that had made it, and in its legs the patience and the power to cross the earth. The horse turned and walked into the sea and disappeared beneath the surface without a ripple, as if it had always known that it was going home. The horse slipped beneath the surface and was gone, leaving only the slow settling of the disturbed water behind it. And Poseidon stood on the wet sand and listened to the waves come in, each one a little different from the last, the sea never quite repeating itself. He had his kingdom. He had his power. He had learned the deep architecture of the world beneath his feet and the broad, restless surface of the water that was his domain. He had created life from sea foam and given it legs and let it go. But there was something the palace in the deep did not have, something the coral gardens and the dark trenches and the long fault lines of the earth could not provide. He was alone, not lonely, exactly. Poseidon was not a god given easily to loneliness, which requires a kind of longing that is foreign to natures as elemental as his. But there is a difference between solitude and completeness, and the deep palace, for all its beauty, all its quiet wonder, was a solitary place. It was his, entirely and without question, but it was not yet a home in the fullest sense of the word. A home requires more than one presence to become itself. He began to notice the Nereids. They had been in the sea as long as the sea had been itself. 50 daughters of the old sea god Nereus in the ocean Adoris, beings of salt water and deep current, as native to the ocean as the fish and the coral and the slow cold pressure of the deep. They moved through his kingdom like the sea moved through it, with an easy familiarity, with a grace that was not performed but simply natural, the grace of creatures perfectly suited to their element. They rode dolphins through the shallower waters. They sat on rocks at the surface and let the spray come over them. They dove into the deep trenches without hesitation, their bodies finding the pressure of the depths as comfortable as air. He watched them for a long time before he settled on one. Her name was Amphitrite. She was not the most obviously striking of the 50. There were Nereids who drew the eye more immediately, whose beauty was louder and more insistent. But Amphitrite had something that the others did not, or rather had it in a greater measure, a quality of depth, of self-possession, of being entirely present in whatever she was doing without any part of her attention leaking away toward performance or display. When she swam, she was simply swimming, completely and without reservation. When she sat at the surface and looked out at the horizon, she was completely and without reservation looking at the horizon. There was no gap between what she did and what she was, and Poseidon, who understood better than most the value of that kind of wholeness, found himself drawn to it with a force that surprised him. He approached her. She left, not in anger, not in fear exactly, but with a quiet and absolute decisiveness that reminded him, in a way he found more compelling than he expected, of his own nature. She did not want to be the consort of a god. She did not want the weight of that particular distinction, the way it would change what she was and how she moved through the world. She valued her freedom the way Poseidon valued the sea, not as something she had thought carefully about and decided to value, but as something so fundamental to her nature that its absence was literally unimaginable. She went to the far edges of the ocean. The versions of the story disagree about exactly where. Some say the mountains of Atlas at the western rim of the world. Some say the deepest and most remote trench in the farthest corner of the sea. What all the versions agree on is the distance. She put as much of the ocean between herself and Poseidon as the ocean would allow. He considered this for a long time. He could have gone after her directly. His power in the sea was absolute and her power was not. And in terms of sheer force, there was no version of events in which she could have kept herself from him if he had decided simply to take what he wanted. But Poseidon, for all his famously ungovernable temper, for all the earthquakes and storms that would later be laid at his feet, was not a god who could not understand the difference between a thing freely given and a thing taken by force. The sea had taught him this. The sea does not force its way into the low places of the earth. It waits, and the low places come to it. he sent a dolphin. The choice of messenger was not accidental. Of all the creatures in his kingdom, the dolphin was the one that moved most freely between the world of the deep and the world of the surface, the one most comfortable in both, the one whose nature was most characterized by a kind of joyful intelligence that was unusual among sea creatures. It was also the creature most likely to be trusted by a Nereid who had good reason to be suspicious of anything sent by the god of the sea. The dolphin spoke, and Amphitrite listened, and the great distance of water between herself and the god who had sent the messenger did nothing to diminish the weight of the words that arrived across it. She thought about it for a long time. This, too, is something the stories note without dwelling on, the time she took to decide. She was not swept away. She was not overcome. She considered carefully and at length what her answer would mean for what she was, and she decided that what was being offered was not a diminishment but an addition, not the end of her freedom but a change in its shape. She returned. The wedding of Poseidon and Amphitrite was held in the deep water, in the open sea rather than in the palace, because the palace was his, but the open sea belonged to both of them equally, and it seemed right to begin something in a place that was already shared. The Nereids came, all 49 sisters, filling the water with their light and their movement. The sea creatures gathered in their thousands, the great whales arriving from the farthest reaches of the ocean, the dolphins leaping at the surface in long arcing lines, the fish schooling in formations of extraordinary complexity that caught what light reached the deep water and threw it back in brief cold flashes. The sea itself seemed to change on that day. Sailors on the surface far above noticed that the water had a quality to it that was unusual, a depth of color that was different from what it was on ordinary days. Something in it that could not be named but could be felt, the way you can sometimes feel when you are near something very old and very important without being able to say exactly what it is. Poseidon brought Amphitrite to the palace afterward. He showed her the coral gardens first. He wanted her to see them the way he had first seen them, slowly and without hurry, letting each detail arrive in its own time. She moved through them with the ease of someone who had spent her whole existence in the sea. But she looked at them with new eyes, the eyes of someone seeing a particular place for the first time and understanding that it is going to matter. She reached out and let her fingers trail along the branches of the black coral and felt the faint vibration of the deep current moving through it, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at the palace itself, its towers of deep-sea stone rising from the ocean floor. She moved through its rooms with a deliberateness that was different from Poseidon's own first exploration of the place. Where he had moved through it with the expansive curiosity of someone cataloging a domain, she moved through it with the focused attention of someone understanding a home. She noted the way the current moved through the high halls. She found the rooms where the light, what faint light reached this depth, came through at a particular angle and fell on the stone floor in a way that was almost warm. She found the quietest corner of the deepest chamber, where the sound of the water above was reduced to the faintest possible murmur, and she stood in it for a moment with her eyes closed. She began, quietly and without announcement, to make it more than it had been. The gardens around the palace changed under her attention. She had a knowledge of sea plants that went beyond Poseidon's, a more detailed and patient understanding of the smaller living things of the ocean. The anemones, the soft corals, the forests of kelp that grew in the shallower water above. She cultivated certain things in certain places. She arranged, with the unhurried patience of someone working at a scale where years are the appropriate unit of time, the living decoration of the palace gardens, until the space around the great coral towers became something of extraordinary and intricate beauty. And children came. Triton was the first and the most constant companion of his father, a god of the sea like Poseidon, but with a particular gift, the conch shell, which he could blow with a force that calmed or raised the waves according to his intention. A sound that carried through the water for impossible distances, the signal that told every creature in the sea that the Lord of the Deep had something he wanted them to know. He had his father's broad shoulders and his mother's ease in the water, and he moved through the kingdom with the confidence of someone who has grown up knowing that the largest place in the world is his home. Poseidon's children were not all born of Amphitrite. The stories make no secret of this. He loved as the sea loves, widely and without the careful boundaries that more contained natures observe. There was Medusa, before she became what she became, when she was still herself, still a being of remarkable beauty who caught Poseidon's attention in the temple of Athena. And the consequences of that meeting would echo forward through the generations in ways that no one could have foreseen. There was Demeter, his own sister, who in one version of the story he pursued across the world, and from that pursuit came Orion, the divine horse, dark as deep water and faster than anything that has ever run across the surface of the earth. And there was Polyphemus, his son by the Nereid Theusa, a cyclops born not in the forge world of his famous cousins, but in a sea cave on the coast of an island where the smell of salt was always in the air. Polyphemus grew enormous and solitary and tended his sheep on the hillsides above the water and looked out at the sea with his one great eye and felt in himself the particular loneliness of a creature too large and too strange for ordinary company. He did not know yet that his solitude would one day be interrupted by a small, clever mortal whose name would become the most famous in all the world, or that the consequence of that meeting would bring his father's wrath down on the sea lanes of the entire Mediterranean for 20 years. But that story was still a long time in the future. For now, the palace in the deep was full of life and sound and movement. Triton moved through the halls with his conch shell under his arm. The Nereids visited often, filling the coral gardens with their presence. The sea creatures continued their ancient business in the water above and around and below, and Poseidon moved among all of it with the settled weight of someone who has found the full shape of his life and recognized it as right. He would still rage. He would still drive his chariot across the surface of the sea in moods that turned the sky dark and threw ships against rocks they had not seen until it was too late. He would still strike the earth with his trident when something moved him to it, and the ground would still groan and crack and answer him in its deep, reluctant way. He would still be Poseidon, restless, powerful, proud, difficult in the way that the sea is difficult, which is to say magnificent and dangerous and entirely indifferent to whether you find it convenient. But he would come back to this, to the palace, to the gardens, to the particular quiet of the deep water at the end of a long age. He would come back to Amphitrite, sitting in the quietest room of the deepest chamber with her eyes closed, listening to the sound of the sea all around her, which was also the sound of home. Amphitrite sat in the quiet of the deep palace with the sound of the sea moving through the stone around her, and above her, far above, the surface world was busy with the particular busyness of gods who have not yet finished deciding what the world is going to be. Poseidon felt the pull of it often. The deep palace was his foundation, his stillness, the place he returned to when the weight of things became too much. But he was not a god made for permanent stillness, and the world above the water was full of contests and rivalries and the slow friction of powerful things existing in close proximity to each other. He rose to the surface often. He stood on the shores of the young world and looked at it with the particular attention of someone who feels that not everything has been distributed fairly, that the lots drawn at the end of the war, for all their rightness, had perhaps not captured the full complexity of what he deserved. This feeling was not simple envy. It was something more textured than that. He had fought in the war as his brothers had fought. He had endured the dark inside Kronos as they had endured it. He was no lesser god, no diminished power, no afterthought in the order of things. And yet Zeus sat on Olympus with the thunder in his hands and the sky above his head. And the sky was where the world looked when it looked up, and looking up is what mortals did when they thought of the gods. The sea was vast and deep and ancient and entirely his, and yet something in Poseidon could not quite make peace with the fact that what was his was the part of the world that was looked down into rather than up at. He carried this feeling the way the sea carries sediment, not on the surface where it could be seen, but deep down, suspended in the current, always present, settling only in the still moments and rising again whenever the water was disturbed. The contest with Athena began, as many things between gods begin, with a city. The city was still young then, a collection of settlements on a rocky peninsula in the land that would later be called Greece. Its people clever and restless and already developing the particular habit of mind that would make their descendants famous, the habit of asking questions, of looking at the world and wanting to understand not just what it was but why. They had built on the high rock at the center of their peninsula a citadel, and the citadel needed a patron, a divine protector whose nature would shape the character of the city and whose favor would determine its fate. Both Poseidon and Athena wanted it. A contest was proposed. Each god would offer a gift to the city, and the people of the city, together with a council of gods, would judge which gift was more valuable, and the winner would claim the patronage of the city forever. Poseidon arrived first. He stood on the high rock of the citadel and felt the stone beneath his feet and thought about what he had to offer. He thought about the sea, its power and its wealth, the fish in its waters and the trade routes across its surface. He thought about his trident and what it could do. He raised it and brought it down on the rock with a force that sent the impact echoing down through the stone to the very roots of the hill, and from the place where the tine struck, water burst upward through the crack in a column of cold spray. It was magnificent. The water caught the light and threw it in every direction. It roared upward with a force that spoke clearly of the power behind it. It was the sea itself, given to the city as a gift, the proof of his patronage made visible and tangible and impossible to ignore. Then it settled into a pool, and the people leaned in to taste it. It was salt, seawater, cold and undrinkable, useful for certain things, but not for the daily sustenance of a city of people who needed to drink and cook and wash and grow things in the earth. The pool sat in the rock of the citadel, and the water in it moved in a faint echo of the tides, rising and falling on its own small schedule. And it was extraordinary, and it was his, and it was not quite what the city needed. Athena came next. She did not strike the ground or call on any dramatic force. She knelt on the rock near the edge of his pool and pressed her hands into the thin soil, and the olive tree grew. It grew the way she did everything, with the quiet precision, each stage of its growth deliberate and complete, the roots going down through the cracks in the rock to find whatever water lay beneath, the trunk rising smooth and silver gray, the branches spreading with the particular unhurried confidence of something that intends to be here for a very long time. The leaves were small and silver, and they turned in the coastal wind so that the whole tree seemed to shimmer, seemed to be in constant gentle motion, seemed to be a living argument for the virtues of patience and careful thought. The olive tree would give oil for lamps and for cooking. It would give food. Its wood would build ships and houses and the handles of tools. It would grow in rocky soil with very little water, and it would live for centuries, and it would ask almost nothing from the people it fed. It was not magnificent in the way that the salt spring was magnificent. It was useful in a way that was deeper and quieter and more lasting than magnificence. The city chose Athena. Poseidon stood on the rock and felt the decision settle over him and said nothing for a long moment. The salt spring behind him continued its faint tidal motion, indifferent to the outcome. The new olive tree beside it turned its silver leaves in the wind. He looked at the tree for a long time, and something in the quality of that looking was not anger exactly, but was the thing that lives next to anger in a nature like his, a deep, slow recognition of something that could not be changed, that had to simply be carried. He struck the sea, not the rock this time. He went down to the coast below the citadel, and he drove his trident into the surface of the water, and the sea responded with everything it had, throwing waves against the shore that climbed higher than waves had any right to climb, flooding the lowland around the peninsula and sweeping through the settlements at the coast with a cold and indiscriminate force. It was not reasoned. It was not strategic. It was simply what he was when he was moved past the point of patience. The sea expressing itself through the god, or the god expressing himself through the sea, the distinction becoming in those moments entirely meaningless. He let it pass in time. The waters receded. The city of Athena dried itself out and began to build in earnest. He did not forgive the decision. Forgiveness was not quite within the range of what his nature allowed for injuries of this particular kind, but he released it the way a wave releases the shore after it has broken, drawing back into the deep water and becoming again simply part of the sea. He was capable of holding things much longer than that, as Zeus would learn. The conspiracy against Zeus began not as a conspiracy, but as a conversation, the way most dangerous things begin, as something that sounds at first like ordinary talk. Poseidon and Hera and Athena, sitting together in one of those divine gatherings that the poets would later depict in elaborate detail, found themselves speaking about the nature of Zeus's rule, about the way the thunder god's authority had thickened over the years into something that felt less like leadership and more like assumption, the quiet belief of a ruler who has held power for a long time that the power is simply his by nature rather than by the consent of those around him. Hera had her own grievances, older and more personal than any Poseidon carried. Athena's motivations were more complex, more difficult to read, shaped by that particular intelligence of hers that never moved in a straight line. And Poseidon had his salt spring and his slow simmering sense of distribution that had never quite seemed fair. They bound Zeus while he slept. The chains they used were things of divine crafting, not metal but something more fundamental, woven from the force of their combined attention. And they held him on his own bed on Olympus while the three of them stood around him and felt, for a moment, the particular terrifying exhilaration of having done a thing that cannot be undone. Zeus woke and found himself bound and looked at the three of them with eyes that contained no panic, no fear, only a slow and absolute fury that was considerably more frightening than fear would have been. What saved him was Thetis, the sea nymph, acting on her own understanding of what this moment would mean for the order of the world, went down to Tartarus and brought up Briareos, the 100-handed one, a creature of such overwhelming force that even 3 Olympians standing together could not match him. He came and stood beside Zeus, and the 3 conspirators looked at the 100 hands and made the calculation that needed to be made. They released Zeus. The aftermath was quiet in the way that the aftermath of very large things is often quiet, not peaceful, but emptied out, the energy of the event having passed through everything and left it still. Zeus's retribution was measured and deliberate, which in some ways was worse than if it had been immediate and furious. Hera was suspended from the sky by her wrists. Athena and Apollo were sent to serve the mortal king Laomedon as laborers, building walls. And Poseidon was sent to Troy. He built the walls of that city with his own hands. The poets tell this as a punishment, and it was. But there is something else in it too, something worth staying with for a moment in the quiet of this story. Poseidon, who could shake the earth, who could raise mountains from the sea and swallow coastlines in a single storm, who had cracked the foundations of the world with his trident just to learn what would happen. This god was set to the work of laying stone upon stone. Ordinary, unhurried, entirely manual work, moving blocks of limestone from the quarry to the wall, fitting them together with the patience of a craftsman, learning in his hands the weight and character of individual stones. He worked in silence for the most part. Beside him Apollo brought his lyre sometimes, and played while they worked, the music rising from the walls of the unfinished city and drifting across the plain toward the sea, which could be seen glittering in the distance from the higher courses of the wall. Poseidon heard the sea while he worked. Its sound reached him across the miles of plain, not loud enough to make out individual waves, but present as a constant murmur, a low, impatient reminder of what was waiting for him. He felt the indignity of the punishment. He was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that, but he also felt something else, something that took longer to recognize, the satisfaction of a thing made slowly and by hand, the particular pleasure of work that produces something solid and lasting, something you can stand back from and look at and know with certainty is real. The walls of Troy rose course by course across the months of his service, and they were extraordinary walls built by a god who had spent an eternity learning the language of stone, who understood rock from the inside out, who had walked the fault lines of the world and knew better than anyone what it took to build something that would last. They lasted a long time, those walls. Not forever. Nothing lasts forever. But long enough to give the city inside them centuries of safety. Long enough for Troy to become what it became. A great city. A beautiful city. A city whose fall would one day inspire the longest and most extraordinary poem in the human world, whose fall would set a man named Odysseus on a sea journey that would bring him across every part of Poseidon's kingdom before it was done. But that, too, was still ahead. still waiting in the part of the future that had not yet arrived. Poseidon finished the walls and returned to the sea, and the sea received him as it always did, without ceremony, without comment, with the absolute and total acceptance of something that does not experience absence because it is not capable of it. The water closed over him, and the pressure of the deep settled around him, and the sound of the surface world receded, and he descended through the familiar layers of his kingdom, feeling each one as he passed through it the way you feel the rooms of your own house in the dark, knowing each one by its particular quality of air and silence. He reached the palace and went to the deepest and quietest room. He set his trident against the wall. He sat in the dark and listened to the deep currents moving through the stone, and let the sea do what the sea has always done, which is simply to continue, patient and vast and entirely itself, indifferent to the pride of gods and the building of walls, indifferent to contests over cities and conspiracies on Olympus, carrying in its depths all the time and all the patience in the world. The slow water moved around him. The coral gardens outside the palace windows grew their black branches in the dark. The creatures of the deep went about their ancient business, and the god of the sea sat still and let the world above him turn, knowing that whatever it became, whatever was built on its surface, and whatever fell, the sea would remain, and he would remain with it, and that this was enough. For now, it was enough. The deep current moved through the palace in its slow and constant way, and Poseidon sat in the quiet of it for a long time before the surface world called him back again. It always called him back. The age of heroes had arrived. Not announced, not declared by any council on Olympus, but arriving the way seasons arrive, gradually, through the accumulation of small changes, until one day the world looks different from how it looked before, and you understand that something has shifted. Mortals were changing. They were growing bolder, more ambitious, more willing to test the boundaries between what was human and what was divine. They built ships and sailed them out beyond the sight of land. They named the stars and used them for navigation. They wrote things down. They asked, with an insistence that was almost endearing, why? The gods responded to this in different ways. Some found it irritating. Some found it useful. Some found it genuinely interesting, the way a craftsman finds it interesting when an apprentice begins to show signs of understanding what the work is really about. Poseidon's relationship with mortals was, like most things about him, more complex than it appeared from the outside. He loved sailors, not in a sentimental way, not in the way that a gentle god loves those in his care, with warmth and easy protectiveness. He loved them the way the sea loves them, which is to say, with a love that does not distinguish between the gift and the test, that offers both passage and danger with the same open hand, that demands of those who come to it a quality of attention and respect that brooks no carelessness. The sailors who understood this, who came to the sea knowing what it was, who read its moods and honored its power and never made the mistake of believing that their skill made them its equal, these sailors Poseidon watched over with something that was genuinely close to care. He had temples on every coast. This was not vanity, or not only vanity. It was also recognition. The temples were the places where the relationship between the god and the mortal was made explicit, where the terms of the sea's generosity were acknowledged openly, where fishermen left their first catch and captains poured wine into the water before setting out. Poseidon felt the offerings in the way that gods feel the attention of mortals. not as a physical sensation, but as something in the quality of the sea around those places. A warmth that was not temperature, a particular texture of the water near coastlines where the temples stood and were tended faithfully. He walked among mortals sometimes in those years, wearing a shape that was roughly human, moving through harbor towns and fishing villages and the shipyards where men were learning to build vessels of increasing ambition. He listened to the conversations of sailors. He watched the way they prepared for voyages, checking the rigging with careful hands, reading the sky with the particular attention of people whose lives depended on the accuracy of what they saw. He felt in their work an echo of his own relationship with the sea. The same respect, the same combination of intimate knowledge and honest acknowledgement of what could not be known. He blessed ships sometimes without revealing himself. A hand laid briefly on a hull in the dark of a shipyard at night. A tide turned at a crucial moment to carry a vessel clear of rocks it had not seen in time. A storm that should have reached a cave by evening held back just long enough for a small fishing boat to make harbor. The sailors on those boats would feel the change in the weather and look at each other and know without being able to say exactly how they knew that something had intervened. And they would pour a little wine over the side before they slept that night. And then there were the others. The ones who came to the sea without respect. The ones who treated it as a road rather than a living thing. Who sailed with the confidence of people who believe that competence is the same as invulnerability. Who looked at the horizon and saw only distance rather than a power that could at any moment decide to express itself. Poseidon was not patient with these sailors. He was not cruel either, not by design. But he was honest. He let the sea be what it was, and the sea, when not persuaded otherwise, was indifferent to the hopes of those who crossed it without acknowledgement. Then came Odysseus, or rather, then came the event that made Odysseus his particular concern for 20 years. Though Odysseus himself did not know for a long time that the difficulty of his voyage home had a specific and personal cause. Poseidon knew Odysseus. He had watched him at Troy. He had seen the quality of the man's mind at work, the way it moved sideways around problems that other minds try to push through directly, the way it found in every situation the angle that no one else had thought to look from. Odysseus had a gift for seeing the world accurately and using that accuracy to his advantage. And it was a gift Poseidon could appreciate in the abstract. He did not dislike the man. What he could not forgive was Polyphemus. His son sat in his cave on the island and tended his sheep and looked at the sea with his one great eye and lived a life that was lonely and simple and entirely his own. He was not a gentle creature. He was the son of a sea god, and he had his father's strength and something of his father's pride and none of his father's complexity. When Odysseus and his men came to the cave, Polyphemus made choices that were terrible and could not be excused. Poseidon did not excuse them, but Polyphemus was his son. And what Odysseus did in leaving the cave was in its own way a kind of insult to the order of things that Poseidon could not simply absorb. He had blinded him. That was the fact at the center of everything that followed. Odysseus and his men had put a sharpened stake into the fire and driven it into the single eye of Polyphemus while he slept. And the Cyclops had woken in the dark of his own ruined sight, screaming a name that was not a name. Nobody did this. Nobody is hurting me. Because Odysseus had given him that name before the act. The last and cleverest trick of a man who understood that the way you protect yourself from a god's wrath is to make it impossible for the god to know exactly who to be wrathful at. But Poseidon knew. In the end, they all knew. He did not go after Odysseus directly. That was not how he worked, and it was also not how the order of things worked. The fates had their own understanding of what Odysseus's life contained, and even Poseidon did not simply override the fates because he was angry. What he did was more subtle and more patient, and in some ways more terrible. He became a presence in Odysseus's journey the way weather becomes a presence, not as a single catastrophic event, but as a persistent condition, a quality of the world that the traveler had to navigate constantly, that never quite resolved into either safety or disaster, but kept him always in the exhausting middle place between the two. He raised storms in the sailor's path. Not always the same storm, not a continuous tempest that would have been obvious in its intention, but a series of difficult conditions, each one requiring Odysseus to make decisions under pressure, to use his considerable resources of intelligence and will and endurance against a sea that was not, in these years, inclined to be generous with him. Ships were lost. Men were lost. The wrath that Calypso gave him when she finally released him was driven apart by waves Poseidon sent from the deep water with a force that should have ended everything. He did not want Odysseus dead. This is important. He wanted something else, something harder to name, something that had to do with a particular humbling that comes not from defeat but from endurance. The understanding that comes to a person only when they have been tested past the point where cleverness is sufficient and must find something deeper than cleverness to survive on. He wanted Odysseus to know the sea, not as a road, not as an obstacle, but as itself, fully and completely, as vast and as old and as beyond any individual's capacity to master as it truly was. There were gods who helped Odysseus. Athena especially, persistent and clever in her own right, working constantly in the background of his journey to mitigate the worst of what Poseidon sent. The two of them moved through those 20 years like two hands working against each other, Poseidon pressing down and Athena lifting, the sailor somewhere in the middle of those opposing forces finding his way forward with extraordinary difficulty and extraordinary stubbornness and the particular grace of someone who does not know how to stop. Poseidon watched him. This is the detail that matters, that is easy to miss in the reading of those stories. He did not simply send his storms and go back to the palace and wait. He watched. He paid attention. He followed the progress of this small and unsinkable human across the surface of his kingdom with something that could not be called admiration and was not sympathy, but was something in the space between them. A recognition. A respect that he would not have admitted to and perhaps could not have named. But that was there nonetheless, in the quality of the attention he gave to one particular set of ships moving across one particular sea. The ships of other heroes moved through his waters in those years too. The great war at Troy had scattered men in every direction across the sea, and many of them had difficult homecomings, and not all of the difficulty was Poseidon's doing. The sea in the Age of Heroes was a genuine and serious place, a place that tested everyone who crossed it on its own terms, without sentiment or special consideration. It did not ask who you were. It did not adjust its storms to your reputation or your heroism. It simply was what it was, and you were what you were, and the question of whether you would arrive at the other shore was answered by the meeting of those two things. But Poseidon shaped the broad conditions of that sea in those years. He was present in it in a way that went beyond the ordinary exercise of his dominion. The Age of Heroes called something out of him that the long quiet ages before it had not required. an engagement with individual mortals, a willingness to involve himself in the particular stories of particular lives in a way that was not quite what he had been made for, but that he found, in spite of himself, genuinely compelling. He built temples in the places where heroes had sailed. Not literally, gods do not build their own temples, but he inspired them, made his presence felt in certain harbors and on certain headlands in a way that the people living there felt as an invitation. Cape Sunium, at the southern tip of the land of Athena's city, where the cliff falls straight into the sea and the water below is a deep and brilliant blue. This place was his, and the temple on the cliff top caught the light of the setting sun and threw it back at the horizon in a way that sailors far out at sea could see as a sign of where they were, as a marker of the known world's edge. He was not always wrathful. This is the part of his story that the later tellers sometimes forgot, concentrating on the earthquakes and the floods and the long campaign against Odysseus because these made better drama than the quieter truth. He was the god sailors prayed to when they were afraid. He was the god they thanked when they arrived. He was the power in the water that had brought them home. He was also the power that had not brought others home. And the knowledge of that was part of what made the prayer genuine. You prayed to Poseidon not because he was kind, but because he was real. And because the sea was his, and you were on the sea. And these were simply the facts of the situation. Odysseus made it home. After 20 years and the loss of every ship and every man he had started with, he arrived on the shore of Ithaca on a Phaeacian boat while he was sleeping, and the Phaeacians carried him to land and left him there and sailed back. And Poseidon, angered by their help, turned their ship to stone at the entrance of their harbor as a warning about the cost of assisting those he had marked. He stood on the floor of the sea that day and looked up through the layers of the water at the surface far above, where the light moved in its shifting way and the world of men went on with its ordinary business of sailing and fishing and building and forgetting. He felt the long weight of the years since Troy in the particular way that gods feel time, which is not as a sequence of events, but as a quality of depth, a sense of how much has been laid down in the sediment of things. 20 years of attending to one man's journey across his sea. 20 years of storms and interventions in the slow, patient exercise of a grievance that had always been, if he was honest with himself, as much about being known as it was about being obeyed. He turned and descended through the water. The palace appeared below him in the dark, its coral towers pale and still. The gardens moved in the deep current, their black branches tracing the same slow patterns they had always traced, unhurried, indifferent to heroes and homecomings and the long, complicated stories of the world above. He passed through the great gate of the palace and into the hall, where the current moved along the floor like a cold river, and the sound of the deep water was the only sound there was. He sat in the stillness of it and let the years settle around him like sediment settling to the ocean floor. Slowly, without urgency, each particle finding its natural resting place. The age of heroes was not over. There were more heroes coming, more voyages, more prayers sent downward through the water by men in small boats on large seas, hoping that what they said would reach something that was listening. And Poseidon would listen. He always listened. It was what he had always done and what he would always do. Attend to the sea and to what moved across it, with the patience and the power and the ancient indifferent care of something that has been here since the beginning and intends to remain long after the last hero has sailed home. The deep current moved through the palace hall, and the black coral grew its slow branches in the gardens outside, and the creatures of the deep went about their eternal business in the dark water all around. And the god of the sea rested in the quiet of his kingdom and let the surface world turn above him without hurry, without urgency, the way it had always turned and would always turn, carrying its small bright lives across the face of the water like foam on the surface of a wave. The foam settled on the surface of the water and was still, and Poseidon descended for the last time in our telling of his story, moving down through the layers of the sea with the unhurried ease of something that has learned, over a very long time, that there is nowhere it needs to arrive quickly. He passed through the surface world first, the bright shallow water where the light came down in long angled columns, catching the silver sides of fish and breaking apart against the pale sand of the ocean floor. He had been here 10,000 times, and it was still beautiful to him in the way that things are beautiful when you have stopped needing them to be anything other than what they are. The light moved, the fish moved. The water was warm and clear and full of the quiet business of living things. He passed through without stopping. Then the middle depths, where the light thinned and the water cooled and the creatures changed, becoming slower, more deliberate, their bodies shaped for pressure and patience rather than for the quick, bright movements of the shallows. He knew them all. Every species, every habit, every migration route that curved through his kingdom on its ancient schedule. He had watched some of these routes form, had felt the first tentative journeys of creatures finding their way across new ocean, had seen the roots deepen over generations into something as fixed and reliable as the current itself. He passed through the middle depths, and the creatures moved around him without alarm, as they always had. Then the dark. It arrived gradually, as it always did. Blue becoming deep blue, becoming a blue that was almost not a color anymore, almost just the absence of light wearing the memory of color. Then that too faded, and there was only the dark, and the cold, and the pressure, which was complete and even in total, the sea's version of an embrace. He had always found this part of the descent the most settling. The moment when the last light was gone and the world above became truly remote, and the only thing left was the deep water and the deep dark and the particular quality of silence that existed down here, which was not the silence of absence, but the silence of something very large breathing very slowly. The palace appeared below him, pale towers in the absolute dark, lit by the cold bioluminescence of the creatures that lived in its walls and gardens. Their light blue-white and faint and steady, the kind of light that illuminates without warming, that shows you the shapes of things without revealing their colors. He moved toward it, and it grew around him in slow stages, each stage revealing more detail. The articulation of the coral towers, the way the garden spread from the base of the walls, the great gate standing open as it always stood, had always stood, would always stand. He passed through the gate, and the palace received him. He did not go to the throne room, not yet. He moved through the halls slowly, the way he moved through them when he had no destination, when the palace itself was the point rather than any particular room in it. He knew every passage, every chamber, every place where the current moved differently because the stone around it had a particular shape that directed the flow in a particular way. He knew the rooms where Amphitrite had arranged things, the particular careful attention she had given to certain corners, certain surfaces, the living decoration she had cultivated over the long centuries of their life here together. He moved through those rooms slowly and felt her presence in them the way you feel the presence of someone you love in a place that is saturated with their attention. She was in the quiet room. She was always in the quiet room when the world above had been loud for a long time. He paused at the entrance to it and looked at her sitting with her eyes closed in the corner she had claimed as her own in the first days after she had returned from the far edge of the ocean, and something in him that was not quite tenderness and was not quite peace, but was something of both settled into the lower registers of what he was and stayed there. He went on to the throne room. It was the deepest chamber in the palace, the one furthest from the surface world. The one where the pressure was most complete and the silence most absolute and the dark most fully itself. The throne was a simple thing by the standards of what thrones can be. It was not decorated with the elaborate imagery that later ages would imagine for it. It was stone, deep-sea stone, worn smooth over the centuries by the current that moved through this room on its slow eternal circuit. And it was the right size and shape for the god who sat in it, and it had been waiting for him since before he was born. He sat down. The current moved across the floor of the throne room in its slow circuit, carrying with it the fine sediment that was always settling from the water above, the constant gentle snowfall of the deep ocean that had been falling since the first rains came down on the young earth and began the long work of filling the low places. He watched it move in the faint bioluminescent light and thought about nothing in particular, which is to say he thought about everything at a depth below the level where thoughts have individual shapes, where they are still just the general quality of a very old mind at rest. Above him, the world was changing. It had always been changing. That was the one constant of the surface world. Its restless insistence on becoming something other than what it was. In the Age of Heroes, it had changed in the ways that make good stories. Great men doing great things. Cities rising and falling. The gods intervening in mortal affairs with the enthusiasm of those who find the short lives of humans both fascinating and convenient. But the heroes were fading now, or had faded, the age of them giving way to something else, something that did not have a god's attention in quite the same direct and personal way. Empires came. He felt them as changes in the patterns of ships on the surface, the way the trade routes shifted as one power gave way to another, the harbors that grew busy and then quiet and then busy again under different names. He felt the temples on the coastlines, some of them growing more elaborate as the wealth of coastal cities increased, some of them slowly losing their worshippers as the people who lived nearby moved or changed or began to pray to different things. He felt the prayers of sailors growing in some periods and thinning in others. He felt the long, slow change in the character of the people who sailed his sea, their ships growing larger and more complex, their navigation more precise, their confidence in their own knowledge gradually increasing in a way that was both impressive and, in a way he found more interesting than troubling. Slightly comic. They would always come back to him. This was something he knew with the certainty of the deep water itself. No matter how sophisticated their instruments, no matter how precisely they could calculate where they were and what the weather was going to do, the sea would always remain the sea. It would always contain, in its depths and in its storms and in the unpredictable meetings of current and wind that no instrument could fully predict, a reminder of what it was. A reminder that knowledge and mastery were not the same thing, that to know a thing and to have power over a thing were different propositions, and that the sea had never agreed to be the kind of thing that could be fully mastered. He thought about the ones who had come to his sea across the long ages. The sailors who had paraded his temples and the ones who had not. The heroes whose stories had been told so many times that the telling had worn grooves in the air, paths along which the words moved now almost by themselves, barely needing a teller anymore. Odysseus, still the most vivid of them in his memory. That small, persistent figure in his small, persistent boat, refusing to go under with a stubbornness that had in the end earned something that was not quite forgiveness but was its nearest neighbor. The others. Perseus crossing the sea to his various destinations. The Argonauts with their extraordinary ship pushing into waters no Greek had yet sailed. Theseus making his crossing to Crete in that complicated story that involved Poseidon in ways the official versions did not always acknowledge cleanly. He thought about the cities. Troy, whose walls he had built with his own hands, risen and risen again in diminished forms and fallen again. The stones he had laid scattered now across a hillside in a land that no longer remembered exactly what had stood there. Athens, the city he had contested with Athena and lost. Its white buildings on the high rock above the sea that he could see from the water on clear days, still there, still standing on the hill he had struck with his trident. His salt springs somewhere in the rock beneath its foundations, still rising and falling with tides that the city above it no longer knew about. He thought about Amphitrite and the 50 Nereids and the long life of the palace and the deep. He thought about Triton and the sound of the conch shell moving through the water in the ancient signal that still meant, to every creature in the sea, that the Lord of the Deep had something to say. He thought about the horse he had made from sea foam, the first horse, which had gone back into the water and was still there somewhere in the deep, moving through the dark currents in its original white, still carrying in its body the memory of the wave that had made it. He thought about Kronos in the dark. He thought about that long stillness inside his father, that dimensionless waiting that had been the first experience of his existence, and he noticed something that he had not been in a position to notice when it was happening, which was that it had been, in its way, a preparation. That existing in the absolute dark with nothing but the bare fact of being had given him something. A relationship to stillness, a capacity for depth, a familiarity with the parts of experience that have no name and no shape, that he had carried with him ever since and that had made him, in some fundamental way, the god he was. The sea had recognized this in him on the day he first walked into it. The deep had recognized it. The dark and the pressure and the silence had recognized in him something that matched them, something that had been formed in exactly the kind of conditions that would produce exactly that quality. He had been made for this, not by plan, not by design, but by the long accident of what had happened to him, which was the same accident that shaped everything, which was simply time meeting circumstance in the dark and producing something that had not existed before. The current moved across the floor of the throne room. The bioluminescent light pulsed faintly in the walls. The sediment fell through the water in its endless, slow snow. Outside the palace, the black coral gardens moved their branches in the deep current, tracing the same patterns they had been tracing since before any mortal had looked up at the sky and asked the first question. Above, the surface world continued. Ships crossed the water. Storms built and dispersed. Tides moved along every coastline in the world on their ancient schedule, pulled by the moon that had been pulling them since before the gods were born. The sea gave and the sea took. as it had always done, without preference, without sentiment, with the absolute and total honesty of something that does not know how to be other than what it is. In the harbors, the last of the old prayers were being said. A fisherman on a rocky coast somewhere in the fading world of the old gods poured a little wine over the side of his boat before setting out, not because he had been told to, not because his father had told him to, but because his grandfather had told him and his grandfather's grandfather before that. And the gesture had become so woven into the habit of going to sea that he did it without thinking. The way you breathe without thinking. The way your heart beats without being asked. The wine spread on the surface of the water and was dispersed by the current and moved outward in a thinning spiral until it was indistinguishable from the sea itself. Poseidon felt it. He felt it the way he felt all of them. All the offerings and prayers and moments of acknowledgement that mortals had sent down to him across the long ages. Not as information, not as requests that required answers, as something simpler, as the feeling of being known, of being seen, even from a great distance, even through the enormous depth of water between the surface and the throne room. Even by a fisherman who could not have said exactly who he was pouring wine for except that it was the sea, and the sea was something, and something deserved acknowledgement. The wine reached him in some form that was not wine anymore. It reached him the way all things ultimately reach the deep, transformed by the journey, changed by the pressure and the dark and the cold into something that no longer had its original shape but still carried in its changed form the intention that had started it moving. He received it and was still with it for a moment. Then the current took it and carried it away, and it was gone, as everything is eventually gone. And the throne room was quiet again, and the palace was quiet, and the deep ocean was quiet in its ancient and absolute way. The god of the sea sat in the dark of the deepest chamber of his palace at the bottom of the world, and felt the sea move around him and through him, felt the tides at the surface far above pulling in their slow, faithful rhythm, felt the cold of the deep and the warmth of the shallows and the middle temperature of the water in between. He felt the creatures of his kingdom going about their lives in the dark water all around him. He felt the coral growing its black branches in the gardens outside, patient as only things that measure time and centuries can be patient. He felt the great ocean currents making their slow circles around the planet, carrying warmth from the equator toward the poles and cold from the poles back toward the equator, the sea's own breath, its own metabolism, its own way of distributing what it has. He felt all of it, and he was still, not the stillness of the dark inside Kronos, that early and unknowing stillness of a god who did not yet know what he was. This was different. This was the stillness of a god who knew exactly what he was and had known it for a very long time, who had fought and raged and loved and built and destroyed and attended and endured, who had learned the full dimensions of himself across an eternity of experience, and who had arrived at last at the particular kind of peace that only comes to those who have been fully and completely and honestly themselves for long enough that there is nothing left to become, only the quiet and ongoing work of remaining. The sea moved. It would always move. It had been moving since the first rains fell on the young earth and gathered in the low places and began the long patient work of becoming what they were going to be. And it would be moving long after the last ship had crossed it and the last prayer had been poured into it and the last story about it had been told and forgotten, and the stones of the temples on the headlands had worn down to nothing, and the headlands themselves had been shaped by the water into something unrecognizable. it would still be moving then. Cold and dark and vast and patient and entirely itself, pulling at the shores with its ancient tidal rhythm, holding in its depths the long memory of everything that had ever entered it, carrying in its currents the slow conversation between warmth and cold that would never be finished, never be resolved, only continued, only deepened, the way the best conversations are continued and deepened across the whole length of a life. The god of the sea breathed the deep water in and out. The throne room was dark and quiet and still. The black coral grew, the sediment fell, and somewhere far above, on the surface of the world, the sea moved in its sleep, turning gently against the shores of every continent, every island, every rocky headland and smooth beach and sheer cliff that the long ages had arranged around its edges, and the sound it made in that slow movement was the oldest sound in the world and the most patient and the most constant, and it was the sound of something that had always been here and would always be here, asking nothing, offering everything, deep beyond measure, quiet beyond words, at rest.